Hello, second grade, and welcome to another part of our investigation this week on mixing liquids with water. So as you remember from the first part of our investigation at the beginning of the week, we looked at different types of liquid, which was syrup, laundry detergent, hand soap, oil, and dish soap. And we placed water inside each of the bottles to see what would happen when those liquids were mixed with water. Now, if you remember, you can also go back to your notebook if you don't remember. When we mixed the water with the different liquids, there were some changes that were happening. Some of the liquids turned foamy. Some of the liquids changed color a little bit. So we left these liquids overnight, and now we're going to look at them again to see if those changes are still there, or if things went back to normal, or if there's any new changes that happened with these liquids and water mixtures. So let's begin. Okay, our first liquid that we're looking at is our dish soap. Yes, our dish soap was left overnight, and there are some changes that happened to it after we were done shaking it all up. Now, remember, you can always go back and view the last video, or you can look at the pictures to remember what happened to the dish soap after we put water inside and shook it up. If you remember, this was all filled with foam. But is it still filled with foam? Not so much anymore. Let's take a closer look. Inside, we now have bubbles. Yes, there are bubbles on the top of the dish soap. At the bottom layer, this is called a layer, we still have the yellow dish soap mixed with the water. We know it's mixed with the water because of the way that it flows. When I move it from side to side, it flows, it moves a lot like the water did. But the bubbles are on top. So let's record our observations in our notebook or our Google slide for another time so we can go back and review all of the wonderful changes. Let's move on to our next liquid. The next liquid we're going to take a look at that was left overnight is our laundry detergent. So remember, laundry detergent is that soap that we use to wash our clothes. And as you can see, there's nothing at the top of the bottle. It's very different from what the dish soap was left with. But if you remember from our investigation at the beginning of the week, when we shook up the bottle, it was still very foamy at the top. Remember? So let's talk about it. Why do you think the dish soap has bubbles at the top, but the laundry detergent does not? They both got foamy after we shook them up, but now only the detergent doesn't have the bubbles and the dish soap does. So you can pause this video and then discuss it with your class. Now that we have discussed all the different properties that the dish soap and the detergent has that makes it still have bubbles and not have bubbles, let's do another liquid. Next up, we have syrup. Our syrup was also mixed with water and left overnight. And if you remember from the previous video or our science notebook, we recorded that there were bubbles up and down the syrup bottle. So let's take a closer look. Are there still bubbles inside? No. Doesn't look like there's any bubbles inside. It looks like the syrup dissolved into the water because the liquid is now flowing a lot like water. It's moving like the water would, not so much like the syrup would. It's moving fast, right? It's a little bit of a lighter brown than before. So it looked like after we placed the water inside and shook it up, that the water and the syrup combined a mixture together. So they made a new type of liquid. So we no longer have just syrup and just water. Now we have a syrup-water mixture. Very interesting. Let's record this in our notebook. Next up, we have hand soap. Now the hand soap, if you remember, was very similar to the dish soap and the laundry detergent when we first shook it up in the first part of our investigation. It got really foamy at the top, okay? And then at the bottom, we still had this mixture of water and hand soap at the bottom layer. But now, look what happened when we left it overnight. Is there still foam on the top layer? Not foam, but there are bubbles. This reminds me of when my kids are trying to make bubbles to play with in the summertime. They take some of the soap, the hand soap, they mix it with water, really good, and then they use that to make and blow their bubbles. So this is what happens when hand soap is mixed with water and left overnight. And as you can see, there is a light pink on the bottom layer, which means that the hand soap is not on its own anymore. It has a water mixture now. As you record that in your science notebook or your Google slide, let's move on to our next and final liquid. Our last liquid here is oil, but it doesn't look much like oil. I think we've saved the best for last, and this one has the most changes. So in reviewing and going back to what we did, remember we had the oil at first, which was a pretty dark yellow or a medium yellow, and then we put the water inside and shook it up. Once we shook it up, we had a oil-water mixture. The oil was floating around in the water. The liquid looked yellowish, a yellowish color. But now there's some changes that happened in the oil that we haven't seen yet. I'm going to try to pull it up closer. So if you look carefully, there are some layers being formed in this oil bottle. On the bottom layer down here, we have a cloudy water mixture. Why do you think the water is cloudy at the bottom? Maybe so, right? So maybe because of the oil, the water is not transparent anymore. It has a cloudy feature to it at the bottom. But now at the top here, do you think this is water too? It looks a little bit yellow. Guess what? At the top here on this layer, we have oil. So the oil and the water, after it was shaken up and left overnight, it actually separated and formed different layers in the bottle, because oil and water are not a good mixture. It does not do well together because of its different properties and its chemicals that they have inside of it. So we have a water on the bottom layer, oil on the top layer. There might be a little bit of water on the very top layer, it looks like, but there's definitely a separation between the oil right here and then the water down here. So let's record this in our notebook or a Google slide so that we can refer back to this later on. So as you can see, in our investigation of liquids mixed with water, there were a lot of different changes that happened. Some of our liquids looked like it returned back to normal. It looked like it reversed, right? Like our syrup and our detergent no longer have the bubbles or the foam at the top. But some of our liquids still held their change, like hand soap and dish soap, because they still have, well, not so much foam at the top anymore, but they have bubbles at the top. And the liquid that had the most change, that actually had a new change after we shook it up, was the oil, because it formed layers, a layer of water and oil after we left it overnight. So just like solids in water, liquids in waters also have chemical changes. Some have more than others, but definitely all have changes. So let's record that in our notebook. And great job, scientists.